I'm John A. Murphy. I'm the Emeritus Professor of Irish History at University College Cork. And in recent years, the governing body has bestowed on me as well the title of the University Historian, which entitles me to priority of parking, which is very nice. And I'm talking today about Alfred O'Rahilly, the most colourful and in many ways the most interesting president in the history of UCC, and certainly the most dominating one over a long period, because even though he was president for a relatively short time, 1943 to 1954, which is near enough to the modern 10-year span of presidents, nonetheless, for 20 years before that, before 1943, before he became president, he was the dominating personality in UCC. He was registrar, appointed from 1920, and therefore he was the number 2, formally speaking. But as well as that, he assumed many presidential powers, as it were, because the then president, P.J. Merryman, was not all that active or dynamic. And Alfred, being the kind of dynamic personality he was, he took immediate steps to fill that vacuum and act like a president. So really we think of him, even though technically it's not accurate historically, we think of him as being president from the 1920s to the mid-1950s when he retired. And that's a long span of time. That's a whole generation, during which he, if you like, formed UCC, as it were, which had come out of the old Queen's College, which had been doing well under President Wendell from 1909, when it became UCC, until Wendell's departure in 1919. But Wendell's presidency was troublesome for complex political reasons, really. And therefore, Wendell didn't get all the time he wanted to develop UCC as it should have been developing. So Alfred was a very formative figure in that regard. And that alone, that lengthy span as the number 1 power man in UCC would entitle him to almost unique consideration. Now, his background was, he was a Kerry man. He was born and reared in Listowel in North Kerry, from what you might call a kind of a rural bourgeois family. The O'Rahillys belonged to the class of town bourgeoisie, for example, in Listowel, which meant, as one little consequence, was that when Alfred was growing up in number 6, the square Listowel, he wasn't really allowed to play with the ordinary kids in the block. And that's not uncommon in the history of Irish snobbery. His mother was the dominating personality. The father wasn't all that effectual, really. And the mother really dominated proceedings. And she was an O'Curry. Her surname was O'Curry. And she was a close, I suppose, collateral descendant of Eugene O'Curry, the famed Irish language scholar. And on Alfred's father's side, he was, or claimed to be, collaterally descended from Eoghan O'Rahilly, the premier Gaelic poet of the 17th, 18th century. So that he could claim then almost to have come from a kind of a Gaelic nobility on both sides, really. And this partly explains his great fierce pride in being Irish and his vibrant nationalism. There's a phrase in Gaelic, mortas kinna, his pride in ancestry. They were a huge family. He must have had 13 or 14 siblings. He was number 8, and number 7 was his slightly elder brother, Thomas Francis O'Rahilly, T.F. O'Rahilly, who was to become a noted historian and Gaelic scholar. The two of them didn't always get on all that well. And slightly after them in the family came Cecile or Cecily, who became a Celticist of international renown. So it was quite remarkable, though maybe not remarkable for Listowel, which has produced such extraordinary people, that in one family there were these three outstanding scholars. And he went to the local national school and for a brief period to the St. Michael's Secondary School. But Blackrock College was his main second level school. And by the way, while he was in Blackrock College, to which he had a scholarship, he was an exhibitioner in the phrasing of the time. And while he was there, Queen Victoria visited Dublin, and young Alfred was lined out with other boys on the footpath as her carriage swept by into the city. And in after years he claimed that he never removed his schoolboy cap while she was passing to show his strong nationalism. And in Blackrock College he had some famous classmates, including Eamon de Valera, in fact. And then he went on to join up, if you like, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. And he spent time with them in different novitiates and colleges and so on from 1900 to 1914. And during that period, long period, but typical, I suppose, of many Jesuit careers, during that period he acquired his expertise in, among other things, mathematical physics, of which he was to become professor in UCC. But also a very wide kind of Jesuit education and all kinds of things, including, of course, theology. And then he was almost on the point of ordination, I suppose, when it was decided that he should leave. Now, partly because his temperament was already manifesting itself as being awkward and not inclined to obey authority. And the Jesuits, above all, put the emphasis on obedience. So that was one thing, his awkward temperament in that respect. And secondly, the Jesuits didn't altogether approve that he had exchanged some letters with his first cousin, Agnes O'Donoghue, with whom he developed what the word relationship would not have the same connotations as it is nowadays. He had a strong friendship with her, with his first cousin. And indeed, he married her soon after leaving the Jesuits. He married her in 1916, I think. So here we have a most peculiar career in Irish terms, in terms of clericalism and that kind of thing. The ordinary person in the 20th century who, let us say, cut short a clerical career in Maynooth, who went to third year, fourth year, and then dropped out, was looked at with a certain disapproval in society. He was the spoiled priest, a phrase which summed up the Catholic public's view of him. He was spoiled material. He hadn't made the grade, and so on. And you would imagine that would apply to Alfie after 14 years. And then marrying his first cousin, which, according to the standards of Catholic teaching at the time, was quite bizarre. You could get a dispensation to marry your first cousin, but it was very odd in the extreme nonetheless. And I'd imagine the ordinary Irish Catholic who walked in off the street and to his parish priest and said, by the way, Father, I want to get married to my first cousin, he'd be shown the door immediately. But Alfred had this charmed existence under the Jesuit kind of umbrella, so to speak. And so he was able to get away with it, as it were. And he then applied for a vacancy in UCC, where, because of the First World War and the depletion of staff numbers, there were a number of vacancies. In fact, Alfred's predecessor as Professor of Maths Physics died in the war, a man called Harper, Professor Harper. And he got a position there in the department from which he graduated from being a lecturer to becoming professor in 1916, I think. And he was set up, if you like, in UCC in 1916. And he already began to take the side of the resurgent nationalist movement in UCC. And he became really, in years after that, the Sinn Féin spokesman in UCC, as against the moderate, pro-British, certainly Redmondite stance of, say, the President Bertram Wendell and quite a number of the establishment professors in the governing body. So then he went on to become, well, he stayed Professor of Maths Physics until 1943, when he was elected President. He was made registrar in 1920, and at that time it was a small college. I suppose throughout Alfie's time as registrar in the 30s and 40s, it never exceeded, say, about 800 students, and didn't go all that much over the 1,000 mark during his presidency. So, if you like, the smallness of the student body enabled him to do more as a scholar and as a public figure and as a controversialist. He was registrar and professor of maths physics, but because, again, of the smallness of the student body, being registrar in those periods didn't entail all that great deal of work. A part-time position, really, but with comfortable prestige and so on, attending it. So we have him then getting involved in what people call the national movement or the revolutionary movement almost straight away from his appointment in UCC. And he, if you like, he touched the edge of greatness in that respect, and that he was more or less part of that penumbra of nationalist glory that attended particularly Cork figures like Terence MacSweeney and Tomás McCurtain. In fact, it was Tomás McCurtain as Lord Mayor on the governing body, because the Lord Mayor was a member of the governing body ex officio. It was Tomás McCurtain who proposed Alfred for the position of registrar on the very day before McCurtain was shot by the raiding party in Blackpool. So, if you like, he shared the reflected glory of things like that. And it showed how much involved he was with the movement at that time. Also, that was the key to one of his most positive achievements in his career, namely, he was the first president really to engage with the town. He was the first town and gown president. He was greatly respected by all classes in the city, partly because he had this revolutionary aura of glory about him. He had known the greats. He had, for example, on behalf of the corporation of which he was a member, it was he who received the remains of Terence MacSweeney when eventually they arrived in the quay in Cork. It was he who nominally claimed, if you like, the corporation's right to receive the body. So all that made him very much acceptable to public opinion in Cork. And because of that, he was able to exercise his talents as an arbitrator in labour struggles and that kind of thing. So he was highly regarded in trade union circles for fixing disputes and so on. A famous one was the retired tramway man. When the tramway system went out of action, he secured an acceptable pension arrangement for these people. But so he threw himself very much heart and soul into the national struggle, and he was imprisoned by the British as an IRA propagandist, and spent time in that colloquial sense, spent time in Bear Island and in Victoria Barracks, which is now College Barracks. And in fact, there's an intriguing picture of him taken by British intelligence with 4 or 5 other Sinn Féin comrades. And they're very much aware of the importance of their catch in Alfred's case, because they have scribbled across the photograph, Registrar, University College Cork. A big prize indeed. And he was annoyed because he didn't get out of jail in time, according to himself, to play a major role in the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations in London in October to December of 1921. He blamed Erskine Childers for that, for in the first place breaking Alfred's code name and bringing him to the attention of British intelligence. But in the event, when he was finally released, he did go to London and play, if you like, a subordinate role in the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations as a backup official, as it were. But he complained that if he had sole control of the negotiations as the secretary, they would have a far better outcome. This was typical of the man's vanity. Frequently well-founded vanity, but vanity nonetheless. That vanity is also apparent in the fact that he wasn't all that satisfied with his presidential portrait when it came to be done in, I think, 1949. He complained to the artist that he didn't make him sufficiently resolute and intelligent looking, and that he was annoyed that his predecessor, Merriman, who in Alfred's eyes was a non-entity, had been given the same looks of intelligence that Alfred had, which wasn't good enough. But he had this vanity which made him to believe that he could have done a better job as Secretary of the Delegation and so on. He took the Free State side, he took the pro-treaty side in the great debate about the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And again, he vigorously participated in that debate. He became a TD later on in the first Cumann Gael government, but only for a brief period, 1923-24. Even coping with that would have been too much for Alfred. But he argued with his typical brilliance that the treaty was a good deal, and we have the pamphlet setting forth his main arguments. And one of these arguments was interesting because it shows how well up he was on the development of Commonwealth constitutional affairs, in that he argued that the Ireland being a member of the British Empire, or Ireland being a member of the British Commonwealth, which the treaty proposed, would in fact make Ireland a virtually independent state, since the Commonwealth was developing towards independence of all the members, and indeed it was. Though in 1921 that wasn't all that certain yet, but Alfred correctly predicted the future affairs. So that he said the king, and so much of the trouble in treaty debates was the oath of allegiance to the king. Real Republicans couldn't possibly swallow that, you know. But Alfred argued that because of the way in which the Commonwealth was developing, a phrase like "God Save the King," or the British national anthem, "God Save the King," could be interpreted to mean really God save the people of Ireland, because the king was no more than a figurehead for the sovereign power of the people of Ireland. So that really by singing "God Save the King" under the Anglo-Irish Treaty, you were really singing "God Save Ireland," which of course was a well-known nationalist ballad at that time. So this is extremely ingenious and proved that his years of training as a Jesuit had certainly been productive. So then, when things settled down a bit after the Civil War, he was called upon by the provisional government of the Irish Free State to participate in the drafting of the first constitution which was performed in the Shelburne Hotel, and he was one of a distinguished team of lawyers who drew up the first constitution of the Irish Free State. So, you know, Alfred O'Rahilly, among other things, was a founding father of the Free State. Not perhaps in a spectacular manner as others, but not as major a founding father, but nonetheless he is entitled to the title. Alfred O'Rahilly made a great impression on the staff and students because of his dynamic personality, his vigour, his combativeness. In appearance, he was, I suppose, maybe unimpressive in that he was a short stature with a tendency to being stout. When, among other things, he put an end to the college rag because of its excesses downtown. The student magazine, The Quarryman, had an inquest on the rag and attributed its demise to a short round object, a short round black object, which kind of typified him because he always wore this paraclerical black, is what I call it. He was extremely combative. He was vain, as I said already. But he was also generous and charitable to people in trouble, especially to members of staff and students. And he did not shout out this virtue from the rooftops either. But on the surface, he could be quite aggressive, and he was once described by George O'Brien, Professor of Economics in UCT, with whom he had a prolonged controversy arising out of Alfred's views on finance and money. And O'Brien felt that O'Rahilly had been very personal in his abuse, and he said though he managed to forgive him, he could obviously not forget how abrasive he had been. And he said, a mad dog always forgets that it has bitten its victims, but the victim never forgets. He said to Sean O'Rahilly once, Sean O'Rahilly, the writer, he complained to O'Rahilly, he advised O'Rahilly to get out of Ireland because there's no elbow room in this country. O'Rahilly remarked that, in fact, Alfred made sure there was very little elbow room in the people who surrounded him. So he had this extraordinary combative and vigorous and energy, unbelievable energy, in the number of interests he had academically and the way he was able to throw himself into all kinds of public issues. He had few outside interests. He married his first cousin, of course, Agnes O'Donoghue, and they lived together in the East Wing. In fact, he was the last residential president. When he was elevated from registrar to president in 1943, he stayed where he was, which was the registrar's house, which is the northern half of the East Wing. He stayed there as president. And his successor as registrar did not live in his quarters anymore in the East Wing. In fact, he took a house somewhere in the college grounds. But from there on, the presidents tended to live outside of college. But so Alfred was the last resident president, and being resident gave his kind of paternal and magisterial role in college a further dimension. He was able physically to supervise students in that if he heard a row going on in a lecture hall across the quadrangle, he could go over and take steps to quell it, that kind of thing. So it was that aspect of him that was the basis for this famous comment of a visiting English extern who, when he returned to England, was asked what kind of a place UCC was. And he said it's like a convent run by a mad Reverend Mother. And that was an exaggeration, of course, but one understands what he meant. So his interests were few, his personal interests were few. He smoked but rarely drank. He had no interest, it appears, in music. And maybe we shouldn't pay too much heed to the Shakespearean injunction in this regard about the man that hath no music in his soul is fit for treason, stratagem and spoils. He had no interest in music. It was simply an undeveloped interest, like other well-known people. For recreation, he read westerns into the small hours of the morning, and that was about it. He simply didn't have time to do anything except the academic research and the big controversies that engaged him in the outside world. As I said, he was never ordained as a Jesuit, but he never stopped being a priest in a way, or a priestly persona. Curiously, Eamon de Valera had something of the same character, that his clothes looked as if they were part of, clerical students' clothes, that kind of thing. And in their way, each of them, de Valera and O'Rahilly, considered themselves to be of the kind of priestly class, indeed of the episcopal class. His interests were widespread, his academic interests. By training, he was a mathematical physics man, but he didn't really star in that as such. He discharged his duties there as lecturer and so on, and supervisor for many years until he became president. But he was interested more perhaps in things like sociology and so on. He wrote a book on electromagnetics, in which he claimed in the end that he had refuted Einstein. And he wrote a book on money. That was an extension really of his passionate nationalism, in that he believed that an independent Ireland should have control over its own money supply, and how right he was indeed. And he wrote a book on money, which had a certain credibility in that the introduction was by John Bustede, who was a highly respected professor of economics in UCC, and who was a great friend of O'Rahilly's, though not extending to all O'Rahilly's interests. But the fact that he endorsed the book gave it a certain stature. Before I leave Bustede, of course, I should relate that Bustede didn't really share Alfred's religious viewpoint or his religious convictions. And when the dogma of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin was proclaimed in 1950, Alfred could barely conceal his excitement at this development. He believed in the infallibility of the Pope, and therefore if he believed in the infallibility of the Pope, then the proclamation of a dogma was no problem whatsoever, no matter how inherently ridiculous it was. And so O'Rahilly chided his friend Bustede for not being excited about this great development. And Bustede replied rather sceptically, well, in my view, every dogma is an assumption, which revealed the kind of great gulf between his and O'Rahilly's thinking. He wrote a book on money. He planned to write a multi-volume history of Christ, which in the end didn't turn out to be any more than maybe one volume. Inevitably, the remark was made that it would be much more interesting if Christ wrote a multi-volume biography of O'Rahilly, but that remark wasn't very original. He was interested in history, and he wanted to, being a Kerry man, he wanted to rewrite Smith's history of Kerry, but never got around to it. In one item, however, he picked out, he wrote a pamphlet on the massacre at Smerwick in, I think, 1579, in which an Italian-Spanish expeditionary crew, a group, landed at Dunanore in the Dingle area, Smeric Harbour, and were surrounded by the English troops under Sir Lord Grey de Wilton, and there ensued what was regarded in nationalist circles as a massacre, that even though the Spanish-Italian garrison were defenceless and had surrendered, they were wiped out anyway. Now, the interesting thing is that in recent years, scholars have devoted themselves to the theme of Elizabethan, if you like, ethnic cleansing in Ireland, and specifically to massacres like Doonor and so on. And their conclusions only bear out O'Rahilly's argument. Now, he made it from a kind of a nationalist point of view, and it was very much a kind of a, not a sheer historical interest, but he was using his historical knowledge to argue his point about English occupation in Ireland. And I read it recently, and I was surprised how good it is, in a kind of dogmatic, polemical fashion, but very good stuff nonetheless. So his interests were enormous across the line. And the conventional description given nowadays to someone whose interests were widespread and varied is that he was a polymath. And I suppose we have to qualify, we have to be critical in our assessment really of what a polymath was. Today, the state of knowledge is such, and the state of specialised knowledge is such, that it would be impossible to even pretend to that extraordinary universal kind of knowledge. In O'Rahilly's day, it was more plausible, if you like, to claim that you knew X, Y, and Z about all the different disciplines. But it was still a remarkable performance. Given allowing or excluding altogether his other roles in UCC and outside it. One of the difficulties for historians, let's assume that they have access to the sources, and let us assume that they can write, and so on, all the other scholarly indispensable qualities. But they also have to understand the colour and feeling and dominant ethos of a period that they're studying. They have to get inside the skin of a particular person and of the environment of the time and so on. And that's very, very difficult to do. I used to advise students to use their imagination, and that's what I meant, like that, to get inside. Unfortunately, some of them felt that I was saying, chance your arm where you can, you know. And so it is impossible to understand O'Rahilly and his time unless we realise that it was a period of, it was an age of faith, of Catholic faith. It was a intensely Catholic ethos prevalent in the state at large, reflected in the laws and so on. But in UCC, we have a president who is, and has never stopped being, an ardent Catholic believer and activist. I was a student in during O'Rahilly's presidency, and so I can personally attest I'm at such an advanced age that I don't even have to use the historian's requirement of having a vivid imagination. I can testify from my own personal experience. I didn't see much of O'Rahilly as a humble art student, but except in one regard. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I certainly can attest to the intense Catholic atmosphere of the campus, in that, for example, masses of students went of their own volition down to St. Peter and Paul's for the opening votive mass of the academic year. No one forced them to do that. Similarly, they participated in the great celebration of the Feast of Thomas Aquinas on March the 7th. I even remember the date vividly, down in St. Mary's in Pope's Quay with the Dominicans. Aquinas was Alfred's intellectual role model, I suppose, one could say. one time when partly his vanity explains this, the president of the student union at one stage was having conversation with Alfred, and the president asked him, what did the students really think of me? And greatly daring, the student council boss said, they think you're a combination of Thomas Aquinas and Jimmy O'Dea. Jimmy O'Dea being the dominant Irish comedian at that stage. And there was that kind of touch about Alfred as well, that in the course of his public debates and so on, he could play the fool a little. He didn't mind acting the boot boy of the comedian if it promoted his argument. But Aquinas was definitely his role model there. And it is said that when he was awaiting the results of the presidential contest in 1943, a friend of his in Dublin sent him the results. The runner-up to Alfred was a Gaelic scholar of somewhat heroic appearance, bearded and so on. And the telegram, those were the days when news was dispatched immediately by telegram. The telegram came down to Alfred saying, Fionn McCool 2, Thomas Aquinas 27. So there was that role. And of course the Irish Times once sarcastically described him as the best mind of the 12th century, which he greatly resented. But that Catholic ethos extended then not merely to events like the great public masses of the year, the missions in the Honan Chapel, which were hugely attended, separate, of course, men students and girl students, but to the whole kind of ethos of the college, in that certain departments were seen, quite frankly, as the preserve of clerics. Philosophy, for example, was a Capuchin preserve for years, and they were dominant also in economics. Education, it was widely accepted, should be a Catholic preserve as well. And for one period, actually, after Alfred's time, the Catholic Bishop of Cork, was able to nominate his choice of lecturers and that kind of thing. So that was quite extraordinary. And Alfred had this belief that the Catholic ethos should extend to the whole university. And here I quote from a statement he made in his own pet journal, the Cork University Record, which he set up, another achievement of his, by the way, which was a very useful house magazine from the 1940s and 1980s. And in the first issue of that, he stated his philosophy education quite frankly. We do not believe in higher education divorced from sound philosophy and religion. Our students are over 97% Catholic, and we do not intend to ignore this fact. Negative non-denominationalism does not appeal to us in Cork. And so UCC would have a Catholic ethos. It would be a Catholic university. Now, of course, he acknowledged the rights of other religions, in that the minuscule Protestant and church and Jewish communities were entitled to their own representation. And he said they could have their own ethos. Why not? I'm not stopping them. But that smacks of hypocrisy, really, because there's no way a handful of Protestants could speak about UCC having a Protestant ethos. There's a picture of him with the chief rabbi at one stage. The Jewish student body was bigger than the Church of Ireland student body. We're talking only in single figures, maybe, at most maybe in the 20s or so. But the Protestants were quite minuscule because they could go to Trinity College, whereas the Jews had no objection to being in UCC, since they couldn't have their own university, and got on very well there. And Alfred is seen in this picture with the Jewish rabbi for two reasons. One is to show how, quote unquote, ecumenical he was, and two, to suggest that there was no anti-Semitic feeling or prejudice in college about the local Jewish community, even though the folklore, the academic folklore, tells us that the Jews found it very hard to get senior posts in the professions in which they specialised, notably dentistry. So it was a Catholic ethos in every sense. And as a student, I remember, I was a resident of the Hone Hostel, which was a Catholic men's hostel. And on Sundays, Alfred and his wife would attend Mass. And he would stalk up the chapel, really, ostentatiously usher his wife into the front row. There was a special seat for the president of UCC. And he would participate loudly in all the prayers. And, of course, one felt sorry for the poor chaplain who had to give a sermon in front of this man, you know. Relations weren't always good between Alfred and the Catholic chaplains. And his behaviour in the chapel reminded me then of the English essayist Addison's famous character, Sir Roger de Coverley, in which he depicts the local squire as ruling the roost in all sections of his estate, not least in the chapel on Sundays, that he would stand up and turn around and see who was present and who was not present and lead the prayers in a loud voice. And that struck me as being very much descriptive of O'Rahilly. Now, at an early stage in his career, in his public career, if you like, he had adduced strong arguments as to why the IRA were right in their policy of ambushes and so on in the 1920-22 period. That was before he took up a different position on the treaty. But he was, if you like, an apologist for IRA atrocities as they would be seen by their opponents. And certainly his views in that regard were totally opposite to the then Bishop of Cork, Bishop Daniel Coughlan, who consequently spoke sarcastically about the Cork Corporation and their late theologian, O'Rahilly, because it was he who advised and influenced the Cork Corporation in their nationalist stance, as it were. And the phrase late theologian clung to him during all his career, and it indicated a certain tension always between the diocesan clergy and Alfred. They were aware that he felt that he knew himself to be intellectually superior to many of the diocesan clergy, and he never apologised for his strong pro-Republican stance during his career. And though he himself would defer to bishops and priests and that kind of thing because of his strong Catholic faith, and he would use the kind of formalities of deference in his letters, nonetheless, they always felt that he was looking down on them intellectually. And there's one photograph we have where Alfred is addressing a students' congress in 1953, I think, and ranged behind him are the official church, including Bishop Lucy, in their full panoply of formal gear and so on, and standing on his own in front looking down the hall is Alfred. And you can see there the undertones of the late theologian thing, you know. He was extraordinarily, he was a very sophisticated Catholic theologian, if you like, in many ways. And he could argue all kinds of sophisticated approaches to the relationship of science and religion. He took on people like Bernard Shaw, C.E.M. Joad, and many others on the English public scene to uphold the Catholic argument on, if you like, cosmic matters like evolution and so on, you know. And so there was that very sophisticated, high-level range of his Catholic thinking. On the other hand, he could be almost pietistic in his interest in, let's say, mystics with stigmata and that kind of thing. I can't recall their names now. He was very interested in the Holy Shroud of Turin. In fact, the wags said that he lectured on it so frequently and so intensely in different parts of Munster that they called it Alfie's flying carpet. And he could be extremely simple and simplistic, one might say, in his Catholic pieties, but he would see that as part of his Catholic persona. So one cannot envisage UCC or understand UCC without remembering all that Catholic ethos. Now, you might say, some secularists today would say that it inhibited real intellectual accomplishments if you had that kind of Catholic deference, if you like. And if you had a situation on campus where the president's office acted as a kind of a thought police department, where the student had to submit their subjects of their debates and their visiting speakers and so on, for a long time after O'Rahilly departed, in fact. But accepting all those limitations, there was still a great intellectual vigour about the place. And if you like, it was the era of Catholic dominance intellectually in Western Europe, as well as the great forces of secularism and so on. And Alfred, more than anyone else, represented that Catholic dominance at the time, I'd say, and would have held his own at any level in Western Europe. In considering his achievements in UCC, strictly speaking, one would have to separate his years as registrar up to 1943 and from there on in as president, 43 to 54. But it would be unrealistic to do that. His achievements in UCC relate to his whole dominant period in UCC, from the 1920s up to the 1950s. And, for example, he modernised the library. He devised his own classification system, which persisted for ages in this place. But he modernised the library in acquiring, in multiplying the number of items on the shelves. And again, it's part of the paradox of the period was that at the same time, he could be party to censorship within the library, in that if you wanted to read certain books, you had to get permission and that kind of thing to approach the X-rated section. But he modernised the library. He founded the Cork University Press, which still flourishes despite various vicissitudes. And that's a great tribute to him. And he founded it partly out of his own pocket, in fact. And his idea there was that an Irish university in an independent state, after all, this was soon after the setting up of the state in 1922. In 1925, he founded the Cork University Press. He argued that a local press, a native university press, was necessary to give an outlet to various scholars who would thereby be encouraged to do their best, as it were, in this new age of flourishing independence. That was his argument behind it. He extended the physical boundary of the UCC by acquiring part of the site of the old county jail, which was then derelict, which had been used as a Boston institution for some time, but then, as I say, was mostly derelict. And he acquired some of this ground. In fact, by the end of the 1950s, all the ground had been acquired. And the first building to be erected there was the Department of Electrical Engineering. So O'Rahilly is to be credited with the first expansion, westward expansion of UCC. And that meant that he was thinking out of the box of his time, really. There was a certain nationalist quid pro quo in acquiring the grounds from the government, namely that the UCC undertook to look after the memorial erected on the jail grounds and the jail site, which now became part of the college site, to those who had died, those volunteers who had died during the War of Independence, who had been executed, who died in hunger strike and so on, and whose remains were transferred to a memorial to UCC, which is a grave site and which we pass up and down every day, really. And O'Rahilly found it easy and congenial to accept that condition because he had been one of them as well. And there's a photograph which illustrates that he's in the middle of old Ireland and so on. But perhaps his greatest achievement in UCC, and outside it really, was the setting up of the whole adult education movement. Now, this goes back to pre-O'Rahilly days, in that his predecessor Windle had favoured extension lectures and so on. But Alfred took it a much step further and developed this out of a philosophy of his own, namely workers' rights, the entitlement of the ordinary worker to a decent education, which circumstances had precluded him from having in the normal course of the school years and all the school-going years of his life. And it wasn't perhaps as totally radical as we would have wished it in later times, but it would be unhistorical to think that O'Rahilly could have expressed fully blown opinions about equality of opportunity and free access to second and third level and so on. What he did was within the limits of his own time, and it was an extraordinary radical movement. The idea that you would introduce ordinary working class people to a degree of further education so that they could lead more fulfilled lives and so on. Now, there might have been an ulterior motive as well, in that the great bogey of the day, of course, in the post-war years certainly was communism. And some people would say that adult education was a kind of a Catholic counter-movement to grab hold of the working classes before their minds were subverted by the communists, that kind of thing. But even allowing for all that, it was still a great educational social movement, the adult education movement. And not everybody was pleased with it in UCC. You know, the notion that the worker should be educated only according to his class and according to his expectations was widespread from Victorian times. And it gelled in with Catholic social thinking as well at the end of the 19th century. The idea that it would be dangerous and inappropriate to give the working class expectations which were beyond their station in life. So Catholic thinking and Victorian conservatism gelled in that point. And so Alfred's enthusiasm wasn't all that widely shared. Many professors in UCC believed that a president had enough to do in attending to intramural affairs, into looking after his business within the walls. And one professor is supposed to have remarked, "I'm not so sure I agree with this idea of O'Rahilly's in adult education, thinking that Jack is as good as his master, and he isn't, damn him." So that was a rather blunt expression of what many people were feeling otherwise. So adult education never got really that wholehearted endorsement, I would think, of the whole college staff until more recent times, when it became a respectable academic discipline. But O'Rahilly's achievement was to set up these centres throughout Munster, and I remember myself giving special lectures in various centres, and therefore fulfilling the basic injunction, the basic mission statement of UCC as expressed in its motto, where Finbar taught, "Let Munster learn." And that Munster dimension was also present in his library expansion, the idea of making the library a source, a resource for everyone in the province. So adult education, I would claim, was one of his great achievements, really. Before 1997, the Universities Act, UCC was part of a federal university framework in which a dominant senate, university senate, representing all the colleges, presided over the deliberations of the individual constituent colleges. And many people felt that this made UCC subordinate and that it had a delaying effect on coming into effective change regulations and so on. But Alfred believed that UCC had practical independence in large measure, that in fact you could disregard much of the supervisory role of the Dublin-based National University Senate, and you had as much independence as you actually needed. That was his pragmatic view. Now, other presidents took a different view, that we needed full independence and so on for different reasons. But that was Alfred's view, and he also did not want to change the status quo in terms of charter and statutes, because God only knows what would happen if you dismantled your present structures and gave the government free rein to devise new university frameworks and institute. So in this respect, he was quite conservative and, in my view, extremely sensible as well. Alfred was a Kerry man in many respects, I suppose, first and foremost in his accent and speech, in that he never acquired Montenotte English, as it were, in Cork. He definitely remained the countryman in his speech. And Anthony Coughlin, the TCD economist, tells an interesting story that in those days, registration in UCC was a procedure whereby you got to see all the principal officers of the college, because of the smallness of the student numbers. You could see the registrar, and in the course of registering, the finance officer, of course, to pay your fees in the end, but also the president. And depending on the president's mood or availability, he might exchange words with the incoming students. And he wished Coughlin every success. He didn't know him. And he said, and look after your character. And Coughlin remembers reflecting that this was the Kerry way of pronouncing character. Be sure and keep a good character. And of course, it is also an Elizabethan pronunciation, which raises all kinds of interesting links about Elizabethan English and Kerry English and so on. But he was interested in, as I said, in writing a new history of Kerry, which he never got around to. He was in close contact with a man called Matthew Byrne, a Listowel solicitor whose antiquarian work he admired and so on. In 1960, he went down to Listowel to open a new national school. But on another occasion, when Kerry County Council and Listowel Urban Council backed the demand for a Limerick University, the demand for a Limerick University was going on from a very early period. In fact, in the foundation of the Queen's Colleges, it was touch and go as to whether Limerick or Cork would be chosen for the southern Queen's College. But Alfred wasn't really very enthusiastic, for obvious reasons, about the University of Limerick. And he got Professor McCarthy in maths physics, who was to succeed him farther down the line as president. He got him to draw up an article alleging that Limerick didn't simply have the numbers or the other basic requirements for university. So when Listowel Urban Council wrote to him and said they'd like his support for the move for Limerick University, he more or less said, well, this is the first time you've contacted me since I became president, and gave him quite a cool reception indeed, and suggested indeed that Kerry as a whole had a bigger claim for university than Limerick. But yeah, I suppose in his personality he was the kind of man who could never really change he could never betray his origins or acquire an ersatz personality. To that extent he remained certainly a true Kerry man. When I was appointed by President Martel in the mid-1990s to be the chair of the new Heritage Committee, one of my strong enthusiasms at that time was that the college should acquire a more recognisable face, that it should be less impersonal, that in other words, buildings should recognise famous personalities and high achievers associated with various aspects of UCC. And to some extent that has been done and is being done, as in the Kane building, for example, the Wendell building. But O'Rahilly, if his ghost is still taking interest in these affairs, can possibly complain about being forgotten in UCC. Now, your average student won't remember who he is, but in other ways, he's all over the place, literally. The restaurant, the main rest, is a monument to him. It was Alfred who devised the restaurant services in UCC, as well as the health services for the students. There were two other achievements of his. And the restaurant, though having been extended and so on, is recognisably as it was when he founded it. And inside in the main dining area, up over the door, is a big painting which O'Rahilly commissioned from an artist called Bernard MacDonagh, and it is entitled The Saints of Ireland, and it shows various metaphorical images of saints and streams and bridges and so on. It's still there. And then outside, as you come in the front doors of the main rest, into the ground is embedded in the mosaic O'Rahilly's new version of the college crest. Now, he had no right to be interfering with the college crest, but again, it was part A, of his vanity, B, of his fervent nationalism, in that he decided that the crowned lion was not an appropriate symbol any longer in independent Ireland for the university crest. So he removed the lion, got Robert Gibbings, the artist, to remove the lion and substitute a big book of learning with a torch of learning and that kind of thing. And O'Rahilly's crest, as one might call it, is still there in the restaurant, and also the same crest under the main archway in the centre of the archway there. Now, as I say, O'Rahilly had no right to do that. It would be like forging your birth certificate, really, and subsequent presidents restored the original Queen's College crest, which is our proper crest. So that's there. Then in the Boo Library itself, near the entrance to the lifts, there's a plaque which was taken from the old library in the North Wing and which commemorates his achievements as director of the library in Latin, this most excellent director of the library, etc., etc. Then most of all, of course, the O'Rahilly building is named after him, and without adding to my own vanity to O'Rahilly's, I may recall that it was I who suggested that building, when that was being built, I felt it was most appropriate that a man who practiced so many disciplinary skills in the humanities by and large, sociologist, political science, and all the rest of it, should be commemorated in this new humanities building. And remembering him most enthusiastically, if you like, is Ken Thompson's gorgeous plaque inside the door, which spells out, again the text is mine, which spells out in achievement his overall place in UCC history. And his overall place in UCC history has to be a great one because of his vigorous presidency, his colourful presidency, his achievements as I have listed them within and without UCC. There is no doubt that he's one of the great presidents of UCC. I make out that since the foundation of the Queen's College in 1845, opened in 1849, there have been maybe 5 great presidents. Now, I limit my assessment to those who are safely dead. I don't take into account any of the pensioned presidents for obvious reasons. But of those safely dead presidents, who would number say about 10 or 11, I'd say there were 4 or 5 who could be deemed to be great presidents. And Alfred must rank very high up on that list.